our guest, Worshipful Brother Ted Cross. Welcome back to the Craftsman Online podcast.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Dude, we are going to be talking about leadership with a capital L. And I have been excited to jump into this with you because I've mentioned this many times. We don't really get into a topic or a theme for a season on a podcast, but this is something that I don't think we talk enough about in our lodges and just in generally about Freemasonry. Before we jump into it and your program that you've talked about, Convince the Science of Leadership, just for our listeners' benefit, what is your background on this topic?
So, I've been a professor of leadership and management at many different institutions. I have a doctorate in leadership and management from Pepperdine University, a master's from University of Pennsylvania, and various other credentials in human resource management. So, I really teach and work in this area, and so I'm excited to sort of how can we simplify some of the steps down from the research that we know and make it more useful for people.
Exactly. Yeah. And just like you, I have an MBA in leadership as well, and a collection of books in my bookcase of ones that I have read and promised to read myself, but to get better at this, because it's more than just something that is going to be a benefit to our lodges and to our fraternity, but mainly to our brothers. And a lot of leadership, at least as you talk about in your presentation, kind of centers around the power to persuade. Why is that one of the areas that you tackle in this program?
The reason I talk about persuasion is that the simple model of leadership that I present is three steps. First, you need to create a compelling vision. Second, you need to motivate people towards that vision. And third, you got to correct course along the way. And so all of that, unless you're a real micromanager, top-down type person, usually involves some sort of influence and persuasion, particularly if we're talking about working in lodges or nonprofit situations or clubs where you might have some positional power as a leader in the lodge, but oftentimes you're asking people to do things based on their volunteer hours, right? There is even inside of businesses, we talk about being persuasive is more important than using your authority all the time.
I just wrote down two words that I want to get to here. It's structural versus practical. So in Masonry, a lot of our structural leadership is the opening and the closing of the lodge. There's ritual that we say everybody has a part or a role to play. We usually follow agendas or some sort of flow when it comes to the structure of our meetings. And yes, you can learn leadership principles there by having that confidence to be able to speak. Outside of that, though, is the practical approach to it. When you have a leadership position, like you're the master of the lodge or one of the wardens, and people come up, and now the conversations you're having now require clear vision, or we got to course correct to get here, and the decision making can be emotional, or sometimes it has to be, we need to get an answer to this right away.
Yeah.
Why so often is leadership an afterthought when it comes to being part of a Mason or the Masonic experience?
I think that inside of Freemasonry, we count on leadership skills being obtained by osmosis or just by, so like you said, by doing some of the things in the lodge. And we don't ever step out and think about what are the theoretical frameworks or the psychological principles that we need to use to be an effective leader. So yes, you learn public speaking through, memorizing the ritual a little bit. Maybe you gain more confidence. You mentioned being able to have an agenda and understand bylaws, and some of those things are structures that are set up for you, and those are helpful to be an organized person. But the question becomes, are you a leader of men, or are you someone who is just, sort of managing the minutia of the minutes and the reports, which oftentimes is what we see in Freemasonry.
What sometimes gets special is we have also terms that we use in Freemasonry, and one that you're going to be like, oh yeah, I know this one, the trestle board, which the trestle board is basically the strategic vision that a master will bring to his lodge. Now, it can also contain the calendar of the year and the events that we're going to do and how we're going to do them, or maybe special events or dinners or other things. But this is a real testing point, I think, for a lot of brothers when it comes to becoming a leader, because I've heard the lodge experience to be kind of described as a sandbox. And for those that don't have these interactions every day in their personal or professional lives, they get to have them in a lodge experience. How is that beneficial, besides the fact that it's like having training wheels? But how is this beneficial as from an educational standpoint to a member?
Well, the good news is it's usually a low stakes environment, and in stakes environments, you're more willing to take risks and try new things, which is where our growth kicks in and where we learn new things by trying new things. There's some structure, like we've mentioned, so you're not just sort of left to your own devices to come up with everything on your own. So that's helpful. But I think that the main thing is the main way that we sort of hope that people gain leadership skills in the craft is through the modeling of other leaders. And that is very important. We can look for mentors and those kinds of things. But I think it's also important to think about, are there steps that we can learn from the leadership literature that can help us be more persuasive leaders? Because, as I mentioned, you need to lead people towards something. And if you can be convincing, it'll probably be make for a better year or 2 years of whatever leadership position you're in.
I'm sure you've read this book. You possibly even have a copy or three that you've given to others over the years. Simon Sinek was the first to kind of make the popular phrase, start with why. Why is it important for leaders to focus on that instead of starting or focusing on the what of a situation?
Well, Simon Sinek famously says, nobody cares about what you do, they care about why you do it. And what he means by that is that purpose is the most important thing, and those are why questions. And why questions are qualitative questions. They're not quantitative questions that you can answer with numbers. And so we often, if we come out of a business situation into the lodge, we're very analytical minded in our personality. We'll want to just make sure that we're hitting whatever goals as measured by X, Y, and Z. But the why question, which is about vision, purpose, and meaning, is qualitative. And you have to ask, okay, what is our lodge's general purpose? And then second, what is my purpose as a leader personally? And then how do I get other people to buy into that? And it's important because that's what people will, quote unquote, die for, right? They're not going to work harder and harder just because of some particular incentives that you create or just because you tell them to. They're going to work hard in the lodge towards a common goal because they find meaning and purpose in it. And so Sinek gives, the famous example of Apple, that their why is more about challenging the status quo. It's not about making computers or iPhones. It's really about challenging the status quo. And because they have that ethos, they're able to make all kinds of products that we will buy, right? Even Apple TVs now that we're watching, which doesn't seem like it should be related to desktop computers.
Or their whole Apple TV production line that's come with all the media they have to create for these devices. But one of the key things that I saw in at least my personal life, and then applied it to my professional life and started realizing the massive difference, was getting to the point of being the master of my profession. Right. And like as the master of the lodge. And Masons will get what I'm talking about here, where there's kind of a check down from the master through the wardens at certain parts during the opening and the closing of the lodge. And I quickly started looking at that and going, oh, that kind of reminds me of the stages of how management is, where you have executives, you have senior leaders, and then you have managers. And that lower level management always stinks because you're literally just managing problems. How do I get away from that to being the person who's handling the bigger things like the vision or the solutions instead of just managing the problems? And to your point, when you talk about when you start focusing on the why, you understand the motivations of individuals. You start to understand some of the root causes of problems so that you're going past being a firefighter to a problem solver.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say there is a difference between leadership and management. I think lodges are great at creating efficient managers, maybe not so great at creating leaders. What's the difference? There's an old story from Stephen Covey. He says, imagine we're a team and our job is to cut a path through the jungle. He says the manager's job is to be down there making sure the machetes and tools are sharpened, that people are getting food and water, that everyone's feeling that they're, getting breaks and all those things. The leader's job is to climb the tree and make sure we're actually headed in the right direction to begin with. And many times what we're doing is practicing really great management skills, which are necessary and needed. Everything we've talked about up to this point of learning how to publicly speak, gaining more confidence, learning how to work an agenda, being organized, planning. The trestle board is about strategic planning, right? These different things are very important. But unless you can be the one that has the vision or collective vision of your group, you might be cutting the path in the wrong direction very efficiently.
In your program, Convinced the Science of Leadership, which you have been very generous to share the YouTube links to that, so brothers can watch that after this podcast episode and even share it in Lodge to get, some deeper perspective and maybe even some ideas on how to become better leaders. You mentioned that humans are not rational decision makers. And immediately jokes started coming to my mind where I'm like, of course, you're talking about past masters here. How as a leader do we adjust for those emotional decision-making moments?
Well, the reason why I bring this up in the leadership context is if my 3 steps are leading is about leading towards a vision, motivating people and correcting course, there's some assumptions that you have to understand in order to do those 3 steps. The first one is that we're not as rational as we think. We all think we're very rational and logical, but the truth is that we're emotional beings that make some rational decisions, and often we'll justify our emotional decisions with rational facts. So for instance, when I want to buy the new mega TV that I want for my wall, it's, is that really a I will look at Consumer Reports and find out which one's the best one to buy, but it's really an emotional decision that I want to buy a bigger TV for some reason. There's something under there. There might be a real utilitarian need, but most of the time it's some sort of irrational, emotional decision. People often have a hard time wrapping their heads around this because you have to admit that if most people are emotional first and rational second, that includes us, our own selves. And that's a hard thing to swallow. So here's a couple examples from the literature. There's a famous experiment where they were feeding people popcorn in 2 different conditions at a movie theater. One condition, they had people go in with a larger popcorn bowl, and in the other condition, a smaller popcorn bowl. And they weighed the popcorn before and after people went to the movie. And they found that when people came back, if they had a large container, they ate more popcorn than the people that had a small container. So that's not very rational that the size of a container would dictate how much popcorn people eat. Then they decided, well, that's interesting, but maybe just there's some fluke in this. So they decided to rerun the experiment. And this time they flavored the popcorn with some bad tasting salts. And they put it in both batches. The one people got bad tasting popcorn in a big bowl, and the other group got a bad tasting popcorn in a small bowl. They weighed it before and after. And again, they found that even with bad tasting popcorn, the larger the bucket that you had of popcorn, the more nasty tasting popcorn you would eat. So it really shows that we make some of these irrational choices that we don't want to admit, but we're operating there. And there's another famous theorist named Jonathan Haidt who brings a great analogy to us about how our minds work. He calls it the elephant and the rider. And he basically says, the elephant is the emotional and unconscious part of ourselves, and the rider is the conscious, rational part of ourselves. And we have to understand that the elephant's going to go where the elephant wants to go. And our job as the rational rider is to try to guide that emotional elephant of ourselves. Freud famously called it, he had a similar analogy about a horse and a rider and those kinds of things. But the idea is there's this emotional unconscious part of us that is running the show by and large, and the rational part of us has to get in sync with that emotional part and lead it. Because if you're fighting against the elephant's going to go where it wants to go. But if you're figuring out how you can be more congruent, then you can make headway. And similarly, when you're trying to convince people or lead people, you have to understand they're probably coming from an emotional reaction first, and rationality second. This is why fake news and false information works so well is because we're emotional beings.
It also could be why, if you ever have a discussion about an event or some sort of financial matter of the lodge, you'll find that some members may have a reaction to it that is very passionate on one side. And you're trying to understand, like, where is this coming from? Like, why is it? Oh, is it just because he's a past master, or is it because he's old and he doesn't want to spend money? And that's not the case. In my situation, it was a past master that was trying to whisper wise counsel of like, hey, we got to watch what we spend. I was like, we're not spending, to the extreme. But the moral of the story was, when I was able to pull him aside and have a conversation to understand where he was coming from, he was part of the lodge when the lodge didn't have a lot of money, when it was struggling, and he doesn't want to see the lodge go back to that day. So he's kind of imparting that wisdom to me. And others may have taken it in an offense where, like, oh, this brother just doesn't want to spend anything. How can we get him out of the room when we have these kind of discussions or votes so that he's not a distraction? But I think it's important that as a leader, one of the things, to put this into principle here, is when you talked about understanding what the root causes are of people, leading them, meeting them on the level, all of the Masonic things that we're being taught. These are the experiences, I think, that kind of provide that sandbox learning experience for brothers that may not manage budgets at work, that you might be the one person in your household when you say something, everybody agrees with it. And there's no question about your authority level. Or, you're free to do whatever you want, whenever you want to. You have complete autonomy because you're a single or an individual person, independent person. And when you get a chance to be in a group setting, you start to understand the dynamics and really the other things that are kind of that secret sauce of leadership.
That's right. And you're making a great point that to convince that brother one way or the other, more facts and rationality wasn't going to change his mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
You needed to understand where it was coming from on the emotional level and speak to the elephant. So that's, the next step is, once we sort of understand that we as humans are mostly emotional, how do we set a compelling vision for people to follow? And the best way is to show people, not to tell them, as our creative writing instructors would often tell us.
Let's get to some college level learning here, because I think that's what benefits brothers a lot. For those that didn't get to go to school for management or business or leadership, and you get to interact with guys who did, it's like a free college course for you. One of the things you get into in your program is called the exposure effect. What is that, and what does it tell us about the visibility of a leader in lodge or in an office?
The exposure effect says that mere exposure to something can influence us. So I'll give you a couple examples that are often cited in the literature. One that is probably particularly salient is, if you've ever gone to a Target store and you walk in, what's the first thing you notice?
Everybody wears red.
Everyone has red.
Yep.
Everyone wears red. And sometimes there's a smell of popcorn from the snack bar, or at least there used to be.
Yep.
And they've done studies that find that if people feel hungry when they're shopping, they'll buy more stuff. Also, in your supermarket, there's a reason why the milk the only thing that you needed to come to the store for, the milk, is in the very back. So you have to walk past all these other things. And then they have the impulse buys right next to the register. This is playing into our emotional being, but it's also using this idea of mere exposure can influence you. There's also a study that is a little bit odd, but these professors decided to have random women students attend their big lecture course at different intervals. So like woman 1 only attended a couple times, woman 2 attended many times, woman 3 attended the most. And then they would ask class members at the end, which one of these women would you rate the highest in attractiveness? And what they found was that the woman who attended the course the most, who showed up in class, was rated the most attractive. So there's this familiarity breeds trust factor to exposure. So if you show up and are visible as a master, as a leader, it's really important. It's also really important. We'll talk about this in a minute. The way you present yourself, because people will make snap judgments whether we like it or not based on that. But yes, in negotiations, there's something called the pegging principle, which is if you have a lot of information going into a negotiation, you should throw out the first number, because studies show that usually the first number that you throw out and the next number that the opposition throws out, you end up somewhere close to the middle of that. Now, if you don't have a lot of information, like you don't know how much something should cost, you should let the other person throw out the number first, because there's asymmetrical knowledge on that. So just the mere exposure to a number will dictate the way an entire negotiation will go.
I'm just cheating to look to see when this episode is going to air for the end of the year review for Brothers, so they're a little bit better prepared when they go in for that. Yeah, exactly. I love that. Or buy a car or anything else these days. I'm guessing you were alluding to one of the other lessons you get into is the Milgram experiment and the power of authority in professional settings. And is that what you were talking about, the presentation of a leader?
Yeah. So you want to create a compelling vision through telling a story, showing examples, modeling it yourself, and being around, as we mentioned. But there is this notion of authority. One of the principles of persuasion that Robert Cialdini talks about in his famous book Influence is authority. And there's the famous Milgram experiment from the 1950s, where Milgram was looking at, why do people follow bad movements like Nazism or other things like that in the world? And so he did this experiment where he brought in people into a lab, and they were told, you're participating in an experiment and you're going to talk into this microphone and ask someone questions in another room that you can't see. And if they get the question wrong, you have to administer a shock. Mm-hmm. And if they get another one wrong, then you got to give them more of a shock. And the only contact you're having with them is through audio, through this talking in a microphone, but you can't see them. And what they found was that people would start getting nervous as the shocks got more severe, as people were, getting questions wrong. And by the way, there was no shocks really happening. This was all a ruse. And so people would start to get nervous after, the light shock, and then there's a dial and it says like harmful, and then it says like possible death or something really extreme. And so they would ask the experimenters, do I have to keep doing this? And the experimenter would be dressed in a white lab coat and would say, the experiment must continue. And they found something like 7 or 8 out of 10 people would go all the way to the shock by death extreme, even though there's really no one back there, but they think there is, just because someone in authority in a white lab coat was saying, please continue on this experiment. So we have to be careful. One, who are we following from an authority standpoint, but how are we also using authority in a positive way? Because if you're in a leadership position, if you have a title in the lodge, you automatically have some sort of authority. And so there's responsibility that comes with that. There's a famous poem I really love by William Carlos Williams. He said, so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow. And I like to change that poem that so much depends upon a white lab coat. This idea of authority, and that can change everything.
I was also thinking of another experiment that I think there's a movie about it on Netflix, the Stanford experiment, and a little bit different, more of a psychology base, but also the same of people submitting to the will and taking the role and conformity. And as leaders, we should be questioning and be mindful of that. But as followers, we also play a role in the leadership dynamic as well. And that we have to understand when we're being told to do something, as you're kind of pointing out, like we need to be able to ask the why and challenge, in some cases respectfully, or just outright, like we must challenge authority in some situations.
That's right. And there's another, so you're thinking of Philip Zimbardo's famous prisoner experiment, and
Yep.
they've rerun versions of this, not inside of universities because no one's been allowed to do those kinds of experiments since Zimbardo did those. But there is this notion of, if someone is put into even a fake authoritative role, they'll often act in very different ways than those who are not in that. So we have to check ourselves, and we have to, make sure that we're being careful with that. And then there's another lab coat experiment I wanted to tell you about. They did this other experiment where they had two different groups trying to solve as many math problems they could in a set amount of time. And one group of people were told to put on a white coat, and they said, this is a painter's coat. Now try to solve math problems while you're wearing the painter's coat. The other group, they gave them the same white coat, and they said, solve math problems, but this is a doctor's coat. So the only difference was whether or not they told someone they're wearing a painter's coat or a doctor's white coat. And the ones that were told that they're wearing a doctor's white coat solved more problems in the same allotted amount of time than the ones who were told it was a painter's coat. That's called enclothed cognition. So literally the confidence was increased when they told them you're wearing a doctor's coat. And it was not heightened up when they said, well, it's just a painter's smock, right? So there's, what I'm getting at is, as a leader, there's a reason why many lodges have certain dress codes, and you can agree or disagree with that. But what matters is you need to present yourself well as a leader of the lodge. Frankly, you have to look the part a bit. Now, that might be different depending on your lodge and where you live and what the culture is, but are you presenting yourself in a way that is building trust and confidence?
So I told myself, after seeing your Convinced, the Persuasive Art and Science of Leadership program, that I was going to do this next problem as an icebreaker the next time I visit a lodge, which is the candle problem, which I saw this, it's like, oh, this is genius. It's a classic test of problem solving where a group gets given a candle and a box of thumbtacks and matches with the instruction to attach the candle to the wall so that the wax doesn't drip on the floor. Sounds pretty simple, but a lot of groups fail. And in that is the whole group dynamic and leadership that comes out of it. But you kind of take it to a different direction when you talk about the context of like lodge business and how sometimes like financial benefits or rewards, like maybe switching a caterer or to a different caterer to save money on dinner, for example, why that might fail to motivate brothers from being creative in settings.
Yeah, and this comes from Dan Pink's book. It's called Drive, and he's citing this experiment called the candlestick problem. And what they found is that the first condition they put people in to solve the problem, they would say, you're being timed on how fast you can finish in this problem and solve it. And the faster you do it, the more money you'll get. That was condition one. Condition two was figure out how to, put the candle on the wall without dripping candles everywhere, and put it on the wall somehow. And we're going to time you about how fast you can do it, but there was no financial incentives. And they found that the group that had no financial incentives finished and solved the problem 3.5 minutes faster than those that actually were given financial incentives. And the answer to the problem is you take the box of tacks, you dump out all the tacks, you take the tacks and you put the tacks through the box onto the wall, then you put the candlestick in the box, and then you can light it, right? Where most people don't even imagine that the box of tacks could be part of the solution. They're trying to just stick a candle to the wall with tacks or melt the side somehow or something like that. But really, the answer is the box of tacks, right? And his argument is that when you require creative problem solving, it's better not to put people into if-then constraints with monetary incentives attached, because it shuts down the part of the brain that is creative. And so you're not going to get very creative things. So if you're just making widgets and you get $1 per widget, sure, that works fine. But in most of our jobs and organizations and in lodges and things are a lot more complicated, and you need creative problem solving. And that requires you to not just have if-then carrots and sticks, but rather, more creative problem solving.
Oh, absolutely. I can think about a conversation I had with a junior warden where I was like, why are we eating Domino's pizza? Or why are we eating this, quick service takeout food? And he's like, oh, well, I'm trying to save the lodge money when it comes to our meals. And I'm like, no, that wasn't the financial reward wasn't this. It was, could we get better quality or different kinds of food? And please don't be concerned about those things. If anyone knows, the worst thing to do to a Mason is get between them and a good dinner. Don't ever do that. Another thing that your program, and again, you can watch this on YouTube, and the link to see Brother Ted's program, Convince the Science of Persuasive Leadership. The link to see that is in the notes for this episode. Just open up your player and you can click on it right there. It is the cute one. You talk about the puppy dog principle. What is this? And I thought it was kind of fascinating on how you summarize leaders can use this for buy-in on bigger or large projects.
Yeah, so if our goal as a leader is to paint this vivid vision that we're leading people towards, and now we're into tactics of how to persuade people, including using authority in a positive way, making sure that we understand people are emotional. Another way to think about this is to ask people for small commitments in order to get bigger ones. So for instance, the puppy dog principle is if you go to a pet store and you're looking at the puppy dogs in the case there, in their little habitat that they have them running around in, the people don't come up and say, would you like to buy that bulldog? What do they ask you? They ask you, would you like to hold that puppy? Would you like to play with it in that little pen room that they have over there, right?
The trick question, yeah.
And if you say yes, then they know that you're going to buy the puppy dog, right? Because once you're holding that puppy dog and you're getting to know it, it's a lot harder to say no to the ask. So they ask you something small and then to something big. And they found this to be true in many experiments. So for example, people canvassing for political parties, if they just go to a door and ask you to put a big political sign in your yard, they'll say no most of the time. But if you ask someone, hey, would you just put this little sticker, it's a tiny 2-inch by 2-inch sticker in your window for the political candidate, most people say sure. And if you come back later and ask for the big sign, then they'll say yes. Same thing, you see this with the charities online, and even our Masonic charities, they ask for a small donation. And then once they get the small donation or the reoccurring small donation, they'll come ask for bigger ones later, because the studies show that you're more likely to do that. It's a foot in the door technique, right? So that's one way to help persuade people, is start small. The other way is to work on the principle of reciprocity. And I think that you were going to ask some questions about that as well.
Oh yeah, and I want to give kind of tie back in. You gave Apple as an example of like, how is Apple doing all of this to get us to buy these devices, and some of them that go into like actual media production companies, and they shouldn't be there. That's not something you would associate with computers, but it all comes back to like Apple has a really, as a former Apple employee, I can tell you they have a big touch rule, right? So if you, back in the day when you went to an Apple store and the laptops and everything were there was a certain way that we would angle at the retail stores the screen for a laptop so that you physically had to pull it to adjust so that you could see it. It was always at I think like a 65 instead of the straight 45-degree angle. That was purposeful so that you would have to pull it in. Why? Because as you're saying, you would touch it, and then you would realize that on that computer or phone or watch or iPad or whatever the device was a dummy version of the iOS software that you could start using as a demo to start doing things. And why is that? Again, so you start, and it was like, oh, you should, how does this phone feel in your hand now, with very limited it was a simple cable wire instead of this lock that was very bolt. We wanted it so that you would have it, or yeah, you could put this watch on and feel what it would be. And then you start changing in the mind. The psychological effect is you start referring it to it as theirs. Like, oh yeah, you look so great with your new watch on. It was just like, oh, the sale is already starting to make itself. Well, the other thing is how did they do it? They figured out a way to start from that computer, to get to the phone, to get to all this ecosystem of devices, to where they were all interconnected. And now the things that you were doing could follow you through across these various screens, and to where they can have movies and TV shows that you're like, what the heck is Apple doing? It was so genius when you look at the plan, but it all kind of started with one of the principles that you mentioned. So yes, this stuff does work. And to your point, it does get to one of the other things that you've often heard. Sometimes great managers or leaders will say, well, I never asked my people to do something that I myself wouldn't do. um, and I've always thought that was a nice little sweet catchy phrase, but we've also heard the term carrots and sticks when it comes to managing people. And I wanted you to kind of expand a little bit about that, because you touch on this in your program as well.
Yeah, it's not that carrots and sticks don't work as a management sort of tactic. As I mentioned, the more complicated the work, the less effective carrots and sticks are. Dan Pink says you should pay people enough to take pay off the table. So you don't want them thinking about that. You want them being creative, unless you're selling cars or making widgets or something like that. The other thing is this idea of reciprocity, that if you want people to make a purchase, buy into your ideas, doing something for them really works. So they've done a bunch of studies that show that waiters that give you a mint after your meal get higher tips.
Mm-hmm.
They'll get even higher tips if they comp your dessert, maybe even more so, even makes up for that loss, right? So there's that idea. So if you want to get, you have to give, and it does help when leaders will model things a bit, like do some of the frontline manager jobs, or go around and try some of these things that can create a lot of trust with their employees. But there is like using more carrots actually in different ways than we're traditionally taught, by giving people things. In many cultures, business starts with a gift. So in Asian countries, and you would certainly bring a gift. And when I travel to Dubai, you often got to make sure you bring the best dates from the best date palms, and you don't talk business for four meetings. So you got to build that relationship.
It's interesting. I was thinking of the waiter scenario, and then now I think a lot of us are used to this when you take an Uber or a rideshare, car somewhere. I think the old stat was, it was what, 15 to 20% higher if they signed, put a smiley face on, the receipt when they gave it to you to pay the bill, because you're going to give a better tip, because there's this connection, there's this joy that comes. It was like, oh, interesting. Once I learned that little stat, it was amazing. You start seeing smiling faces everywhere. It was like it was in some magazine. But to the other part, and I know this isn't really on leadership, but just a point that you were making, we do live in a very tip incentive society right now. And one of the things that drives me absolutely crazy is, before I even use the service, they're asking me if I want to add a tip to the bill. And ride sharing is an example. The place that I order my pizza from, they'll say, hey, do you want to add a tip to this? And I'm like, I haven't even received the product yet. Why would I want to do this? I'm just, just for me, is there any kind of business principle as to why this has happened, or is this just a byproduct of COVID that's hit us now?
I'm not sure exactly, but I can venture a couple guesses. The first one is, if they're asking for a tip right at point of purchase, you're more likely just to do it just because of force of habit, right? Rather than, and you're standing in front of someone. So there's a social shaming aspect that is coming in there. So instead of being able to get your pizza in your house and, decide later if you want to give a tip, you might not give as good of a tip as I have to stand in front of Michael and say what kind of tip I'm going to give.
Right.
Similarly, at like CVS or like Rite Aid, and they ask you when you're buying something, do you want to just donate $1 to X and Y charity? They know that you're already in the mode of making a purchase, and that maybe $1, this small ask that we talked about, won't be that much, and that you will do it maybe. And so that's why they're asking at that moment.
Yeah, my favorite is, you got another one that just gave me a Spurs, the car wash place. They love hitting me up for a tip before the car actually gets washed. And I'm like, but the last time the guy didn't even get the streaks off the back window.
Right.
The important part, I think, when it comes to leadership is you should always be self-evaluating. And you talk about this in your discussion where, yes, what is a leader's job? They provide the vision, they provide the plan, they provide that coaching, the persuading to get people to things. They're aware of the goals, they're looking for the opportunities, they see the problems. We can all think of good leaders, whether it's sports or in business or whatever the setting is. What is the first step though when it comes to auditing yourself and being? I imagine a listener right now is like, well, I have a really hard time talking people into doing something or getting people to do things for me, and would that not make me a good leader?
Well, what I often hesitate when I teach these principles of persuasion is they can be used for good or for bad, right?
Right.
And so it's really important that whatever vision you're going towards is grounded in pro-social values, whether those are, uh, faith, hope, and charity, or brotherly love, relief, and truth, or the four cardinal virtues, or some other sort of values that are positive that you're grounded in. If you have a positive vision, that can help you audit yourself and make sure. Again, remember we talked about cutting the path in the forest and the jungle, and if you're not headed in the right direction, you need to sort of correct course. Well, if you don't have that really strong vision that is grounded in pro-social values, it's easy to get off course, but it can serve as your North Star to audit yourself. Then, are my actions, are our initiatives, are our goals, is our progress towards this bigger picture? It also
Mm.
helps to get rid of stuff that may be interesting but not important to the core vision and mission of what you're trying to accomplish. So it can be a screening mechanism too. Here's our vision. Someone suggested this really interesting project, but does it align with what we're trying to accomplish with our vision? No? Okay, then maybe that gets put to the back burner instead of to the front, which is often what happens. The loudest voices get the things to the front. But if you can point out, we all agreed on this vision that we're working on together. Does that really fit that? Or how does it help me see? You can make some decisions and you can audit yourself and sort of the progress you're making in your organization.
Mm. I teased on this earlier, but I wanted to come back to it because I, I I heard a brother say this one time, and it kind of blew me away. Where public speaking, putting together a budget, leading others was not part of his profession. He was in the IT. Well, he still is in the IT world, so he kind of works independently on projects. Um, was like in a mid-management level, so budgeting and some of these things weren't a big concern. And public speaking, definitely not, being someone who was back in the server or a rack room. And he kind of credited getting the opportunity to be master of the lodge as an opportunity for him to come out of the shell. The thing that's always funny is he says he's one of the worst public speakers that's out there, but he's the kind of guy that once he gets started, good luck trying to get him to stop.
Yep.
He's never had a problem with it. I think one of the things that is beneficial for brothers is that we do have this progressive line and that concept of going through the chairs and learning these parts. How is that helpful in your opinion for guys that Freemasonry is the entry point into them becoming a leader, not only in their lodge but also in their life?
The progressive line does a couple of interesting and positive things. The first one is it's scaffolded in its learning. So the junior warden has to know less than the senior warden, ritual wise and otherwise, and responsibilities wise, than the master, right? And so you have this opportunity to slowly learn. Like when you're learning a language, you don't just start reading books in that language. You start with some basic vocabulary, then you conversational, then you get to expert, right? So a similar sort of scaffolding of learning is helpful. There's also the modeling aspect that we've talked about, which is you get to see someone ahead of you and how they've done it and what worked and what didn't. Of course, there's also Grand Lodge initiatives for line officers to do leadership training and those kinds of things. But there's also some bad things about the progressive line. One is that sometimes in some lodges, it locks in somebody who gets into the line that isn't a good leader and isn't good for the lodge and puts them into a position of power for one or more years, depending on the terms that your lodge has in its bylaws. And so you have to be careful there, like how do we help someone that we see that is going to be master at some point that might not be great for the lodge? Because we've all experienced one bad master can set a lodge back 5 to 10 years,
Yeah.
And so how do you help them to, if they're going to be the master no matter what, almost, how do we help sort of train and model those kinds of things? And that, of course, comes in from the Grand Lodge, past masters, and those kind of modeling.
also think that culture comes into it a bit as well. It's interesting you touch on that point, because I've seen lodges that the pendulum has swung from, a master that's got, a jam-packed trestle board with all kinds of events and programs and speakers and, wow, just get your calendar open on your phone and get ready to plug in a bunch of information, to swinging over to the guy that's like, well, we'll see who's going to be here that night, and then we'll do whatever we do. And we could
Right.
just get pizza or do, and you're like, well, this other guy did this, and to go swing from swing. And I think at some point, like, the lodge culture kind of comes in and polices that. But to the other point, I think one of the benefits of a progressive line is getting to see an example of something. And good or bad, I've always said that bad managers are sometimes the best examples, or the best learning situations on how to become a better version of yourself.
Yeah, what not to do, right?
Exactly.
And we do know from social science and the persuasive leadership literature that modeling is one of the most effective ways to help people come along. So I don't know if you remember, but when I was a kid, we had Dare to keep a kid off drugs at school.
Yes. Yeah. I remember the shirts. Yeah.
We had,
Yeah.
we had Officer Friendly come talk to us about
Yeah.
X, Y, and Z. Well, when they looked back at the data from that program from the 90s, they found it was actually a very ineffective program for keeping kids off drugs.
Really?
And they wondered why. And they looked at other programs and they found that the most effective program for keeping kids off drugs was Big Brothers and Big Sisters.
Hmm.
And the reason is because there's someone in your orbit assigned to you that is modeling and role modeling a different way of living than maybe someone just coming in and telling you not to do drugs, which kids often hear as do drugs.
Yep. Yep. I'm thinking of the South Park episode. Yeah. Drugs are bad. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly.
Well, yeah. Very interesting. So your program, it got into a lot of the, technical and, higher ed. You did a great job of breaking down the lessons and making it practical for all the brothers, as I said, to go from kind of situational or structural leadership to the opportunity to actually be a practical and putting things in out with an intention to lead. I want to get to you personally, because as a past master, you've got a wealth of examples and experience. And as a brother Mason, like, was there a particular moment where you could point back and say, like, wow, even with my professional or educational training in leadership, this principle got tested. I was tested in this moment, and I was able to use Masonry as my own sandbox.
Oh yeah, I've done that a lot, and I'm only a past master of a research lodge, so I don't have all the experience that you have. But having been an orator for many years and trying to do the educational programs and lead others and being a trustee of the lodge and those kinds of things, you see all kinds of things. And I've definitely had I'll just give you an example. I don't love going to business meetings because they're boring and I sit in business meetings all day, right?
Right.
And sometimes I think in my head and I have these feelings like, why are we talking about this? And I want to say that, right? I want to say, why are we even doing this? And then I remember, then I step back and say, this is somebody's chance to learn and play in the sandbox, like you say, in this low stakes place, express their opinions and be able to talk about why they want to do it this way or that way. And that's all right. And just let it go. And the importance of even that boring business meeting, which we hold on a different night than stated in our lodge, so we can get to the fun stuff in stated meetings, can be really important places to learn some skills of management and leadership. And I've had that tested. And then I have similar feelings to you sometimes. Other lodges I belonged to in the past have had very large balances of funds, and yet we're never raising dues, or we're never, getting any good catering or food or events, or the lodge building is falling apart. You know what I mean? So those are frustrating things. And I think that I've had to learn, like you were talking about earlier, there's reasons behind that, especially from the Great Depression folks who are still around and the way they feel about things. And if you can meet them on an emotional level on specific fixes or things that you need to do around the lodge, they'll come along, but not until you listen to what they have to say and why.
Yeah, I think that's a really strong point, Ted. That when you take a step back and realize as a leader that sometimes this moment isn't your moment. This isn't your learning moment. It's somebody else's opportunity. And you get to kind of be literally in the audience for some of those. I recently, last night, I was on a call and I'm like, these two guys are going to spend the whole time arguing about something that is just really, but it was just interesting because eventually the one guy quit trying to just, as we talked about, quit trying to keep providing facts and rationalize. And we got to, it was the change, the idea that we were going to change a process. And that was just the underlying thing that the other brother that was opposed to. And once we said, but this doesn't change the way you're going to do this. This is just going to change the way that we're going to do this as a lodge. You're still free to do this however you want to execute it. Oh, it was like, yeah, man, you could have spared us all 50 minutes. But I understand that. And it was just neat sitting there going, oh, I want to say something. I want to get involved, but just going, this isn't for me. This is for this other brother. This is his time to figure this out.
Yeah, and that's applying your practical wisdom you learn along the way, when to step up, when to step back, when to let other people do
trust
things
me,
they're good at.
After 15 minutes, I was ready to step in.
Yeah.
Well, I always enjoy our time together, and I'm looking forward. You began this conversation before I hit the record button, teasing me with another idea as to how we can share practical leadership and lessons to brothers throughout the craft. And I'm like, yes. So we're going to build on that conversation for next time. But for this one, Worshipful Brother Ted Cross, thank you so much for being on the Craftsman Online podcast.
Thanks for having me.